tonight on Nation to Nation. A tailings pond leak at an oil sands mine in northern Alberta went unreported to local First Nations for months. Green Party co-leader Elizabeth May pulls no punches.
This is a crime committed by Imperial Oil against the Athabasca Chippewa First Nation.
Ontario Native Women's Association's executive director gives a dire warning about human trafficking.
Indigenous women are targeted for this type of violence, and they're not choosing, this way of life.
Child advocate Cindy Blackstock told members of Parliament they have the power to make the lives of First Nations children better.
If they don't do it, it's a choice, and they bear the responsibility of owning that choice. But sadly, it's First Nations children, youth, and families that will bear the consequences of those decisions.
Ani Bojo, I'm Annette Francis. Welcome to Nation. A piece of legislation that will take on environmental racism is currently being debated in Parliament. It's a bill sponsored by Green Party co-leader Elizabeth May. For May, the perfect example of what is environmental racism is happening in northern Alberta, where a leak from a tailings pond at the Kearl Oil Sands mine has been going on for 9 months, and where the Mikisew Cree and Athabasca Chippewa only recently learned of it. This is what May had to say about it earlier this week.
This is a crime, and it comes under the category of environmental racism. And I'm calling on the federal government, Greens call on the federal government, on the Minister of Environment, Minister of Fisheries, throw the book at Imperial Oil. This is criminal activity.
Joining me now in studio is Elizabeth May. Welcome to Nation.
Thank you so much, Annette.
Glad to have you. So what exactly is environmental racism?
It's really a very well understood term for when the treatment of the environment, dumping of toxic chemicals, whatever the issue is, it's clear that would not happen to a settler culture community. In other words, it's the differential between, can you imagine this happening to a white suburban community in a rich neighborhood that a toxic waste site is on top of you? Can you imagine this sort of thing happening? And when you ask the question, and the answer is obviously, no, that wouldn't happen. Overwhelmingly, if you map Canada for exposure to environmental risks that are also human health risks, overwhelmingly it happens in Indigenous communities, to marginalized communities, whether racialized, low income, Indigenous. That's where you find a lot of environmental abuse that amounts to threats to human health.
So how will your proposed legislation help those First Nations that are living with those toxic conditions in their communities?
Well, we're really demanding that the Government of Canada catch up with work around the world. So this is not unique to Canada that we see environmental racism. I think everybody watching this can think of examples around the world. The solution to environmental racism is to be proactive, to have a program in environmental justice. And environmental justice in the United States, by the way, since 1994, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency has had a well-funded program in environmental justice. This says to communities that are lacking the resources to fight back against polluters, well, here's some. You have access to scientists. You have access to lawyers. You have access to programs that allow you to get this stuff out of your neighborhood and demand polluters clean up. So an environmental justice program at this point is to be developed once the bill is passed. But the goal of the legislation is that all manner of environmental racism, and I could give you other examples in my own community in Saanich Gulf Islands, the Department of Fisheries and Oceans just does shellfish closures in the areas that are traditional food harvesting for Wasanich Nation peoples. Well, DFO doesn't go out and test the seafood to see if it's not safe or not. They just year after year say, this is closed. That's environmental racism. So there's many aspects to it, but it's giving the tools and ensuring that Indigenous communities, First Nations, Métis, Inuit peoples have tools to say, this polluter needs to get off our land and this polluter needs to clean up the mess they've made.
You called what happened in northern Alberta a crime, yet few corporations are ever charged with crimes. And this bill, there's nothing in the bill that relates to any charges being laid on offenders. What can be done there?
Well, I think we need to identify this as crime. And by the way, the laws exist to charge them. There's the appalling 9-month period when the Athabasca Chippewa Cree were not warned. This is extraordinary that Chief Alec Adam was kept in the dark for 9 months and now has to tell people in this community that the fish and the country food they've put by can't be safely eaten and they should be prepared to destroy it. This is a crime committed by Imperial Oil against the Athabasca Chippewa First Nation. So what do you do with criminal activity? You throw the book at them. We're demanding that the Minister of Fisheries and Oceans and the Minister for Environment use the tools they have to prosecute this as crime. I also think it's important to identify that and I increasingly do this and get in trouble with someone someday, but given what we're looking at in terms of the climate crisis and the climate emergency, corporations in the oil patch that knowingly have lied to people for years, that have promoted their profits over human survival, let's call them what they are. They're organized crime. They're a criminal class. They may be billionaires. They may have, they do have vast wealth. But if they're committing criminal actions, they have to be charged. And we're not going to make a difference, frankly, if they get a slap on the wrist and a fine. We know how corporations deal with that. It's the cost of doing business. I think we really need to be looking at jail time for executives that knowingly allow people to be poisoned and don't warn them.
So I want to turn to the latest climate change report coming out of the United Nations, and it's looking pretty dire with catastrophes, possible catastrophe. What will the governments do this time around? Are they going to take action?
I don't see any sign of it. I mean, honestly, here we are with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is the largest scientific body ever created by human civilization. It's the peer review process to beat all peer review processes. They're saying, look, if we don't act immediately, we will not have a chance of holding to 1.5 degrees global temperature increase or staying below 2 degrees. The opportunity, that window of opportunity, is going to close quite rapidly, which is why the IPCC says this is the last report, because just in terms of the physical time it takes to research these things and turn out that this is the 6th assessment report since the IPCC was created in the early 1990s. This is the last report before the window closes, because it takes on the order of 6 to 7 years to pull one together. So here we are in 2023. The window will have closed without dramatic action before 2030. And in terms of the advice in the last election campaign from Assembly of First Nations was really clear. The climate crisis requires immediate action. And we know what we have to do. We have to stop adding and start subtracting. So no new pipelines, cancel the Trans Mountain Pipeline. No new oil and gas drilling, cancel Bay du Nord. Stop adding and start subtracting right away, or our kids don't have a livable world. We're not even looking at the traditional thinking into the 7th generation. Talk 2 generations. Where's our moral compass? What's wrong with us as a settler culture Canadian and grandmother? What's more important than preserving a life for our kids and our grandkids?
Are we collectively at a point, like in the movie Don't Look Up, that there's nothing more we can do about the climate crisis?
There's tons we can do. We're at that point in Don't Look Up where there was time and then they blew it because they listened to the crazy billionaire. Okay, so let's listen to the scientists. Let's look at what we can do. We can cancel the Trans Mountain Pipeline, which right now is going to cost the Canadian public $30 billion. Convert billion into millions. $30,000 million. That's not acceptable. Cancel it. We can cancel drilling off Newfoundland and Labrador, cancel Bay du Nord. We can ban fracking everywhere. It releases vast amounts of methane, and while they say LNG is a clean burning fuel, the total footprint of fracking for natural gas is worse than coal. So we need to be serious about what is essentially a carbon budget. We can't put more greenhouse gases into the global atmosphere and expect that we're not kicking climate into climate emergency on steroids. We have the opportunity, and we have just barely enough time, and we're in a free democratic society where we can speak up and speak out and demand that, that returning to idle no more. No more of this, please. We understand that we have one chance to ensure our children and their children have a livable world. It won't ever go back to what I experienced as a child growing up. We're not going to go back to a lovely, stable climate. We're going to endure at least 100 years of disruptive climate events, more floods, more droughts, loss of ice, extreme weather events. That's what we're in for. But we can act to avoid a spiraling out of control where the climate emergency overtakes human society and we lose our opportunities because human civilization begins to crack apart under the strain of the climate emergency. We have time to save ourselves. We don't have time for a single additional dollar being spent on fossil fuels.
All right. Miigwech, Elizabeth May, thank you.
Miigwech.
Stay tuned. After the break, we'll hear from the Executive Director of the Ontario Native Women's Association about human trafficking. Ani, welcome back. It's an alarming statistic. According to the Native Women's Association of Canada, 50% of human trafficking victims are Indigenous women. In 2019, the federal government launched a national strategy to combat trafficking when it committed tens of millions of dollars to combat the problem. Yet exploited youth and women continue to fall through the cracks. A House of Commons committee is currently studying the ongoing issues. Coralie Maguire-Surette gave testimony at that committee, and she joins me now. Welcome to Nation, Coralie Maguire-Surette.
Well, thank you. I'm happy to be here.
So what does human trafficking look like today? What types of exploitation is there?
Trafficking looks unique in each community. And so, you can have trafficking, for instance, in a northern community connected to man camps, trafficking kind of more in southern, kind of larger urban centers we'll look at trafficking through like Airbnbs and, so it really is unique in each community on what trafficking looks like. But I think the one piece I think people really need to understand is that, Indigenous women specific experience in human trafficking is very unique, and they're targeted. I know there's this thing about being vulnerable, but Indigenous women are targeted for this type of violence, and they're not choosing this way of life. And I think about a grandmother that we work with, a knowledge holder in this area, and she always reminds us, Mona Hardy, that the first profession was motherhood.
Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit peoples form a disproportionate number of those sexually exploited in Canada through human trafficking, even girls as young as 13 years old. How could someone identify a person that is being trafficked?
Definitely. Identification is key to being able to provide the right supports for that survivors of human trafficking need to be able to heal. So it's critical that we learn what it looks like and some of the key warning signs for our loved ones. And so, one of the first factors we actually notice is if somebody's often going missing, there's that connection to missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. So, not knowing where a person is or who they're with, they could have new clothing, shoes, hair, nails, access to substances that they weren't able to afford previously, and changes into their appearances. They may suddenly be wearing more or less sexualized clothing, tattoos. There could be signs of physical abuse, such as bruising, cigarette burns, fractures, and also looking at people's emotions. There could be an increased level of anxiety and depression, nervousness, paranoid. And so just really looking at, changes in a person's being of who they are and being able to be, have those conversations and asking people, like, is everything okay? And being that safe person that they can come to talk to and helping them get a connection to services that can help them.
Why exactly is it that Indigenous people are being targeted, and how can we stop it from trafficking happening in our communities?
We need to really address the systemic and cultural factors that create the conditions by which Indigenous women and girls are being targeted for trafficking. The process of colonization has effectively groomed Indigenous peoples for exploitation and human trafficking, and subsequently Indigenous women and girls are, especially targeted for exploitation. And so we really have to be able to break this down from a systemic level, and institutions designed to keep individuals safe, such as the child welfare system, youth in the justice system, are grounds where Indigenous women and girls are recruited into these situations of exploitation. And so in order to improve Indigenous women and girls' safety, we need to address the intersection of colonization with poverty, racism, sexism, trauma, and look at where do we begin to have those healing investments in our communities, because we haven't had any substantial healing investments from colonization, particularly us as Indigenous women. And so we really have to look at those adequate long-term sustainable investments into programming which is designed by and for Indigenous women.
What are you hoping the Status of Women Committee does with your testimony, with the evidence from other witnesses as well? Longer sentencing, for example?
We really want the committee, we're going to be providing our perspectives on how to prevent the trafficking of Indigenous women. So we really want to look at improving Canada's law enforcement to apprehending and prosecuting perpetrators. And being able to really amplify Indigenous women's experience on human trafficking. And the impact of colonization has eroded our fabric of a strong, self-sustaining community. And the intergenerational trauma that we face has normalized violence against Indigenous women and girls, and it's not okay. And we need to change this in this system. We need to change this in Canada. We have to stop normalizing the sexualization of Indigenous women and girls here in Canada, period. That there's not too many, when we look at the stats, the level of exploitation, the sexualization of Indigenous women and girls is rampant, and it's a crisis here in Canada. And we have to address it. We have to interrupt this violence today for our grandchildren's grandchildren.
All right. We'll leave it there. Miigwech for joining us on Nation to Nation.
Miigwech, maintenant, merci.
Don't go away. I'll be right back with Cindy Blackstock. Welcome back. Cindy Blackstock is probably Canada's most well-known advocate for First Nations children. Her struggle to get them treated just like non-Indigenous children has gone on for over 20 years. And over those years, she's sometimes had a difficult relationship with the federal government, even being spied on by CSIS. But she's never stopped advocating on behalf of children, and that includes earlier this month at a parliamentary committee looking at children's health. Here's part of her testimony.
I mean, when we all saw the children in unmarked graves, when we all wore the orange T-shirts, we were making a promise to the residential school survivors to make sure that what happened to them doesn't happen to their grandchildren.
Ani, Cindy Blackstock, welcome to Nation to Nation.
Thank you very much, Annette. Good to be here.
What was the main idea you were trying to convey to committee members this time around?
That inequality for First Nations children, youth, and families has a severe price for them, but also a severe price for the Canadian government. In that by continuing these inequalities, the Canadian government is not only going against reconciliation, it's actually increasing the amount of costs that will have to be borne by because the trauma will increase for these people as time goes by. It's far better, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure.
How surprised were you when NDP MP Don Davies asked you to compare the health outcomes of First Nations kids to their non-Indigenous counterparts? Shouldn't this be information widely known by now?
It should be widely known, Annette, but I'm not sure that everyone does understand it, even in the House of Commons. I think that people hear a statistic in one area, like the overrepresentation of First Nations children in care, and then maybe a couple of months later hear a story about the overrepresentation and poor health outcomes, but they don't necessarily tie those threads together.
Mm-hmm. In your opening statement, you said during Canada's non-compliance period, 2 children died. That could be linked to the inequities. Can you describe how that makes you feel?
It is devastating. And that is only a glimpse into what those families feel. I mean, this is the case of Wakapika First Nation, of course, where the children had developed a suicide pact, and an urgent request went in from that nation for mental health services to the Government of Canada under Jordan's Principle. They ought to have been approved immediately, but it sat on someone's desk, and sadly, these 2 12-year-old girls died of suicide months later. Waiting for the Government of Canada to really honor Jordan's Principle. That type of behavior is unacceptable. And that's why the need for remedying these inequalities is so urgent.
You've also said that you don't know what's going to happen to Jordan's Principle beyond 5 years. Is there a possibility the funding inequalities could return?
There is a possibility of that. I mean, but thankfully, we at the moment have the legal orders by the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal to be a safeguard. But we have to take every measure we can to ensure that the discrimination doesn't happen again.
You've testified many times before parliamentary committees over the years. Does it not get frustrating and you have to ask yourself why you keep doing it?
Yeah, you know what's frustrating is I see all the solutions to remedy the injustices for children, for women under the MMIWG, for the TRC. And what I get frustrated at is the lack of action. And that's what I really was trying to emphasize to these members, is that they have the power and the solutions to be able to remedy these injustices. If they don't do it, it's a choice, and they bear the responsibility of owning that choice. But sadly, it's First Nations children, youth, and families that will bear the consequences of those decisions.
Can you give us an update on where we are on the settlement agreement for Jordan's Principle?
Yeah, so as your viewers know, we are in negotiations on long-term reform. We call it long-term reform, but it's really about stopping the discrimination in CFS, Child and Family Services, and Jordan's Principle, and making sure it doesn't happen again. We got the resolution by the Chiefs Assembly saying that we need to make sure that any long-term solution is community informed, is reviewed by First Nations experts on the ground in the communities, and then goes to leadership for approval. And that's the direction in which we're heading. We should have more details to share with everybody soon.
Okay. Miigwech, Cindy, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Annette.
That's it for the show this week. I'm Annette Francis. Miigwech for joining. Have a good night. And if you missed any part of tonight's show, you can check out our podcast. Go to aptnnews.ca/podcast.